Well, good day, folks. Hope everything's going well for you today. Today I'm going to do a review of the information I've compiled on The Secret by Byron Preiss. Today we're going to be looking at image three and pointing out the things that I think are important to figuring out where this particular item is placed in the ground. I usually am going to start this by going over the image itself and pointing out what I see in the image. I will be away from the chat if you join in for a while, and then we will get into the presentation. Okay, so we have this image number three, I guess is the one we're looking at, and it appears to be like this figure in a, let's just say, attraction type position. In other words, the image figure is affixed, if you will, to a post. It appears to be an armored type of figure at about the waist area where the guts would be. You have the guts spilling out, if you will, and it's sitting on some sort of pedestal base. Okay, so my initial reaction to this is George S. Patton, General Patton. And so if we're going to take that assumption, we need to learn a little bit more about George S. Patton and who he was and what he was about. But before that, I want to point out some of the things that I see in the image. So a lot of people haven't pointed out or talked about, and I'm using the PB Works images. So a lot of people haven't pointed out over in the area of around, let's say, the JK area 9. So there's a little round ball, if you will, and you've got the black wall there in the background, right? Well, I think that there's a dolphin there. That round eye forms a dolphin. There's obviously a watch clock pointing over here at a certain time, like 1 o'clock maybe. You have a tank on the number 9 at the F and G of the arm on the right hand side. There's a tank. There's a tank right there in that just a little bit further from the wrist. There's actually a tank sitting in there. Uh, you have this ball figure, looks like a baseball. It's a two-seam baseball at the 7 F and G location. Uh, you have what appears to be some sort of pedestal base at the 6 7 FG area right next to that ball area. Um, you then have the fixture holding up that arm is got at the GH and the 6 position. You've got the scabbard or the guard, if you will, of a sword. And if you follow that outwards, you have the first instance of a sword with the part that protects the hand, if you will, while holding a sword. And so you have that coming out at that particular location. If you go to the 6th location, that little dot around the G and H and the, let's just say the breast, below the breastplate or in the breastplate, you have another little tiny tank sitting in that area as well. I also think that that's another dolphin with the eye, with that little round circle being the eye. And so I see that as being a dolphin as well. So if you move down to the red area, the gut spilling out, if you will, so you've got this little projection at the H area around the 7 location. It's the first of the guts that's pointing to the bell, and that's another sword. In fact, if you go look up the Patton sword that George Patton uh, redesigned, that's the actual sword configuration. But if you take the two little things that protrude out into the background at about the H location, right above that sword, you have the first part of a horse that's formed here. And what you have is a cavalry horse with that line of the belt going down, forming the mane of the horse, if you will. And then the eye of the horse is just, right behind the cavalry sword. The bridle then is that little tiny uh, piece that goes down over the front of the horse. And then you have these legs that are formed within the head of the horse going forward. And the reason that's there is because George S. Patton was a cavalry man. Uh, he studied the cavalry. Okay, so we've got also several more swords coming out of this image as you follow those different items along the red part of the guts that are spilling out, if you will. So if you go on further down into the image around the L area and the K area in the 5/6 of the base itself, I actually see either a baseball bat. So you've got this round appearance, like the end of a bat, if you will. And then you've also got below that a stage. So you've got like the curtain of a stage there with a light shining on it, like a projector, like they're projecting an image onto a wall for a stage so that you can watch some sort of production. Then below that, you have that sitting on a table, a table base, if you will. And perhaps maybe George S. Patton was born on the dining room table. Maybe that's supposed to represent some dining room table in somebody's house where somebody was born. So, like, you have him being coming out of the table, like that's where he was born, if you will. And then you have this affix of the guy in a traction position, which is how he died. So the image is showing you from death to verse. So I'm going to go back over here to what I consider to be a P. And so if you go to the baseboard of this floor, if you will, there's like a floor, and then there's like a baseboard, if you will, and there's a spoon in here. There's an actual, it looks like there's a spoon sitting here about the M location over to the 8. Then next to that, you have another item, and I think I explained what that item was. I think it's a shovel. I think there's a shovel then over in the N location on that baseboard down there. But let's just look at the baseboard, if you will. If you look at this baseboard and you then look at the shading of it, and you start at the M area, and you then follow the appearance. You get a corner of the state of Kentucky, right there. You get the basically the west corner of Kentucky is shown. If you start at the base, you start at the base, and you use the base of the pedestal at the M location, and you use the bottom line or the top of the baseboard as the bottom of Kentucky, and you use starting out at the baseboard, and then you follow that curvature up, you see the part of Kentucky that they want you to look at. So then when you get over here to the edge, you've got the 9-10 location at about the, let's say, L and M, a P. It's an upside down P. But I like the fact that it's a horseshoe as well, because that would fall right into the pattern. But you've got a P right there. So you follow that over to the bulging guy at the KL location that's dangling down around 3. And if you take his 2 legs, and if you look closely, there's a line that connects them at the knee. And you call that an A. Then you go to the next location, which is the 2-3 location, and L, and you have a T. And then you go back to L, and you have in the 1L position another T. I don't care what you use for your O and your N on this, because at that point, you've pretty much spelled P-A-T-T. You know, the O could be any of these hoops. Any of them. Or the daisy. But so the leotard, so your guy holding up this little flower is wearing a leotard, right? And he's got a bulging belly. Well, Patton's famous, for the Battle of the Bulge. But the reason the guy is in the leotard is because not only was George S. Patton a military leader, but he had an early interest in fencing. And that's why when you get to a verse and you get to a verse with walls that are metal and it's a fence, if you will, they're going to draw you into another clue about his fencing. And the image is then going to match the verse having to do with fencing. You're also going to have military leadership involved and how it draws itself into the verse and explains the image. Okay, it's pretty obvious there's a bunch of bells in this, and there's obviously a bunch of um, signaling devices and keys and some things like that in the image as well. And so, you have to, figure out, well, there's going to have to be something that has to do with that. Uh, the Okay, so I think I mentioned most of the things that I wanted preliminarily. I will probably come up with something that I left out want to talk about as we move further on. The Obviously this dangling set of things could be some sort of uh, a line that goes from pole to pole, if you will. Um, but anyway, I'm fairly comfortable with these observations that I made on the image. Okay, so let's then just we can go look at a Wikipedia of George S. Patton. It's pretty long, but and I'll let you read it and come up with more of the inferences, if you will. Uh, but George Smith Patton Jr. was born on November 11th, 1885, in Los Angeles, in San Gabriel, California, to George Smith Patton Sr. Okay, well, once you research the Patton family goes back many generations of having the same name. In fact, it could go back 5 generations or 5 steps, if you will, in the lineage of George S. Patton. And so if you go to George S. Patton Sr. and you look up George S. Patton Sr. to see who his father was, his father was an attorney. Um, so he was an avid reader. He went to the classical school for boys, etc. So his father, George S. Patton Sr., was an American attorney. He was Los Angeles County District Attorney and first mayor of San Marino, California. Uh, so George S. Patton, the attorney, was the son of Susan Thornton Glassell and George S. Patton Sr. George S. Patton Sr. was a Confederate colonel during the American Civil War. His mother moved to California after his father was killed during the war. And so the senior Patton of George S. Patton, in other words, George S. Patton's father, moved to LA after his uh, uh, father's father, his grandfather, was killed uh, in the war. Um, so uh, so Patton, George William Patton, was born in Charleston, West Virginia. This is the Patton that died in uh, the Civil War. His parents were George S. Patton Sr. Okay, let's go look up George S. Patton Sr. Uh, so Colonel George Patton Sr. was a Confederate colonel. He was the grandfather of, okay, we already talked about that. So John Smith Patton's the son of politician John Mercer Patton. Okay, so let's go look up John Mercer Patton. He was the 19th century politician and lawyer from Virginia. He served as the United States House of Representatives uh, from 2 different districts. So this Patton was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Uh, and he was born to Robert Patton, a British immigrant of Scottish extraction. So this is where we actually can finally break the chain of Patton. Uh, so I'm getting to the point where Patton was a generational uh, figure, if you will. John M. Patton enslaved 9 people, 2 boys and a girl under 10, as well as 2 men under 35, 2 women. So anyway, he was, I guess, a slaveholder. But anyway, so on with the story. So I'm looking at the idea of Fort Knox. And so you need to know a little bit about Fort Knox. I'll let you look up the history of Fort Knox and everything that's involved in the Fort Knox. Louisville and Nashville Turnpike. So Fort Knox is situated on Kentucky US 31, and this is a turnpike. And we have in the back of the book the toll trolls, if you will. And then also in the back of the book, we have the gin rummy sitting on a Dixie Highway sign. And so I think this gives you some confirmation that there is something that has to do with the Dixie Highway. Um, and where do you get whiskey, alcohol? Probably Kentucky is as good as a location for that. So I wanted to just point out that this location is adjacent to those two factors. So when you read about Henry Knox, you'll find out that his parents were Scots and they immigrated to Boston. Uh, Henry was admitted to the Boston Latin School, where he studied Greek and Latin. Is this kind of making sense in that we had a puzzle in number 2 that had to do with the Boston Latin School? And when we go to the next puzzle, we're going to have Greek and Latin influences. So, these characters that you get introduced to seem to have a relationship from the previous puzzle to the next puzzle. And so then Knox was a witness to the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre, if you wanted to consider the dot in the previous poem, or not poem, but image, the dot is exactly the center of where the Boston Massacre occurred. And so if you look at the little flower in the previous image, that little circle is exactly where the Boston Massacre occurred. And so Henry Knox is actually considered a founding father of the United States. And he was a senior general in the Continental Army and Revolutionary War. Okay, so if you use this location, you now have 2, let's say, confirmations of a place where you have military leadership, the study of military leadership, and military leaders involved. I was going to mention Fort Duffield because it's in this area, and some people have been I don't know, West Point. Some people have been misled in believing that some West Point has to do with this all for this image, and it's in another state. Well, frankly, there's a West Point, Kentucky, and it's at the location of Fort Duffield, which is geographically approximately very close to Fort Knox. And in addition, is adjacent to the Ohio and is also adjacent to Indiana. And so we have this border involved between Indiana and the United States and Kentucky, where the Ohio River separates the 2 states. And there's a lot of Indiana back of the book references. And so if you want to know about Reverend George Duffield of Detroit, and the son was William Duffield, these are basically a reverend and then a Michigan infantryman. So I just point out this Fort Duffield and West Point is in the area. I mentioned earlier the dolphin. And the reason I pointed out the dolphin is because to many people, George C. Scott is General Patton because many people in my generation grew up on the movie Patton. and George C. Scott played Patton in the movie. It was a highly successful movie. Uh, the guy refused to accept the award for Best Actor uh, for Patton. And so it made big news in the 70s. But the funny thing about is that George C. Scott went on to be in this movie called The Day of the Dolphin. And so there's scenes in the movie where, if you will, you have, in essence, George S. Patton working with dolphins. And, this is the kind of thing that I think that the writers would have worked into their um, film, if you will. Uh, and the irony is that in the plot of the Patton film, General George S. Patton addresses an unseen audience of American troops, emphasizing the importance of Americans' place on victorious role models as well as its own demands in order to defeat the army. Okay, well, there's a famous speech that uh, Patton makes in that particular movie, and then here you have at the end of the Day of the Dolphins, the same guy addressing a pair of dolphins as if they're military troops, and which they are, because in that movie there was they trained these dolphins to plant a bomb on a ship, and they killed the president. But anyway, all right, we talked about Fort Knox and how it got its name. We talked about the leadership there. We talked about the United States Bullion Depository, which is approximately in Fort Knox. And the reason this is important is because of the gold appearance of the image. And also, if you actually look at the United States Bullion Depository building, you can actually see the turret, the gun turrets, where they have the men positioned in order to protect the gold. And if there's any coliseum with metal walls, this certainly might be it. Uh, and so there's the gold depository. Uh, I There's an article of what's left at the Patton Museum now, and there still is an M60A1, an M4A3E8 Sherman, an M7 Priest, an M10 tank destroyer, and some other vehicles, but it's not what it was at the time the book was written. I attached a copy of some of the things that the history of the museum, if you're interested in that, and then I also attached a map of the Fort Knox Post, so you can see where the Dixie Highway, Highway 31 West, uh, goes directly by the Patton Museum. Uh, Now, there's a water park on the other side of the interstate, and there's also a small little park over there. And then this also shows you where Keys Park is in relationship to the museum. Okay, so I'm going to just now dive into how I think the puzzle works um, using George S. Patton's story. And I'm going to do this by just kind of reading some of the things I wrote in my WordPress article. So I believe this image can be explained by looking at the elements in the image. First, the most striking element is the armor and exploding belly area, which we've already established as part of Patton. So if you look at the speech where Patton said that it took blood and brains to win in combat, reporters began calling him Blood and Guts. So Patton was named by the press as Old Blood and Guts. The nickname would follow him for the rest of his life, and even the soldiers under his command almost always sometimes would say, "It's our blood and his guts." Patton was described as an intelligent boy and widely read on classical military history. So some of the things that are in General George S. Patton's reading list include the manuscripts of Preiss and Xenophon. So if you look at those two, those are actually part of his reading list. There are things, and then if you look at the other list of those, you'll have all of the different things that uh, he read. Pat married Beatrice Banning Eyre, the daughter of Boston industrialist Frederick Eyre, on May of 1910. So Frederick Eyre made a fortune selling patent medicine. And so I think this is what explains the spoon in the image. I think this is the Franklin or the Frederick Eyre and the Beatrice Banning Eyre. And this is why I really actually think that the San Francisco puzzle is on um, Catalina Island, because here you have a link between image puzzle, this puzzle, and one that would go back to the first puzzle and make it be in Catalina Island, because there's a Banning bench. And if you look up Beatrice Banning's relationship, you eventually fall into this uh, Chicago Cubs, and we've already had one found, and the Wrigley family and the Banning family and Wrigley's ownership of Catalina. And so if you start working all that together, here you possibly run into the Banning bench on Catalina Island being a final solve location for the first puzzle, and vis-a-vis then using Natalie Wood, and that actually being Catalina Island by way of San Francisco, where Katrina, which was her Natalia Katrina. Anyway, that's where her Russian roots come from for Natalie Wood. He also joined the football team, but he injured his arm and stopped playing on several occasions. And so he went and worked out at track and field and on the sword team. And he became a pentathlon. He competed in the so Patton competed in the 1912 Summer Olympics in Stockholm, and this could explain some of the rings that are in this, the circular rings of the Olympics. But if you look at the mask that he actually has on in this image is a fencing mask. If you look at the guy with the bulging belly, that's a fencing leotard. In other words, he's wearing a fencing leotard. And then I already mentioned all of the different swords that I found in the image. Patton also redesigned the saber combat uh, for the cavalry, and he invented the model 1913 cavalry saber, which then popularly became known as the Patton saber. And if you look at the Patton saber, you can parry on, if you will. I included on my secretsolve.wordpress.com page the picture of George S. Patton fencing at the 1912 Olympics, just for an example. And then I also showed Patton on his horse. And if you then go look at the image, you can see both of those incorporated. Uh, so he was burned by an exploding gas lamp. I think there's actually a gas lantern in here. But if you use the correct verse, you will get this lit by lamplight verse as confirmation for the verse that correctly matches to the image. So when you get to the actual verse, knowing that Patton was burned by an exploding gas lamp uh, will help you with the verse that says lit by lamplight. Anyway. While in a hospital for jaundice, he met this Colonel Fox Connor. And I think that if you look at that little first detail over on the left-hand side, there's a fox face or an animal face coming out of that image. So he earned the Distinguished Service Cross, and maybe the little cross hatches are not spelling out Patton, but are just telling you that he earned the Distinguished Cross. So at one time he had some of his tanks stuck in trenches, and he made his troops dig some passages and he was involved in this scandal about hitting one of them over the head with a shovel. And so I think that maybe that's where the shovel comes in. Uh, in 1923, Patton also saved several children from drowning when they fell off a yacht during a boating trip off Salem. He was awarded the Silver Life Saving Medal for his action. Well, Palancar and crew, when you mentioned Salem and witches, maybe you were just referring to the fact that he saved some children from drowning. So it's, again, going back to the first image, somebody drowning. Here we have Patton rescuing some people that drowned. The Boston Tea Party, you had tea thrown into hob. It's all about water. Anyway, Patton left the conference room, phoned his command, and uttered two words, "Play ball!" This coded phrase initiated a prearranged operation order in Patton's staff, mobilizing three divisions for maneuvers during the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, I threw that in there just to prove that he was an important factor in the Battle of the Bulge. I also put that in there because the previous image for Boston was all about playing ball, and I also mentioned that because in the shoulder area of the armory, there's a baseball. On March 26th of 1945, Patton sent Task Force Bomb. Okay, so I mentioned this because, there's the phrase in one of the verses about ride the man of Oz. And other people in this thing have said, oh, they're referring to the Wizard of Oz, the guy that wrote the Wizard of Oz. Well, I'm not so sure you're not right about that because, this is another thing that would tie into additional puzzles as they come forward as to things that have to do with this Patton and have to do with the other puzzles and the actors involved. After all, in the Litany of the Jewels, some of these people interact with each other from time to time. And I think key to solving all the puzzles is to find the interactions between who appointed Knox, who was president when Knox was appointed to the military. What was that guy's name? When Seward's Folly happened, who was the person in the story about Seward's Folly that appointed Seward and made him the head of that? And so anyway, so Patton also has some ties to Massachusetts, and he talked to some people there. So Patton's chief of staff was Major General Hobart Gay, and Hobart Gay invited him on a December 9th pheasant hunting trip near Spire to lift his spirits. Now, just to confuse us, they have another verse that talks about in December, our Tower of Delight falls, if you will. And so, observing the derelict cars along the side of the road, Patton said, okay, so in the back of the book, if you're talking about derelict cars, you have the derelict cars that Chrysler made. You also have the derelict car that blew up when its gas tank exploded and the tank went boom. And so most of these cars, and then you have the actual car in one of these images running into something. So in the Kindergarten ones, on page, what is it, 119, 118, you actually have a car with a stick running into a big blob, if you will, right? Okay, so how awful war is. Think of the waste. This is a quote from Patton that can be later used in another puzzle where you should think of the waste. But anyway, moments later, his car collided with an army truck at low speed. Gay and the others were slightly injured, but Patton hit his head on the glass partition in the back seat. Okay, so how many in the back of the book, how many of these stories have a window, if you will, some sort of glass window, some sort of a person appearing in front of a window, that kind of thing? Well, there's several instances of this. And I think maybe those are the stories that would corroborate this story and go along with this particular story. the ones that have to do with the window and somebody crashing into the window. Um, so what happened is that he began bleeding from a gash to the head and complained that he was paralyzed and having trouble breathing. He was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg. He had a compression fracture and dislocation of the cervical third and fourth vertebrae, resulting in a broken neck and cervical spine cord injury that rendered him paralyzed from the neck down. Well, I'm pretty sure that image figure is in a paralyzed condition. But he spent the next 12 days in spinal traction to decrease the pressure on his spine. All 9 medical visitors, except for Patton's wife Beatrice, who had flown from the U.S., were forbidden. Patton, who had been told he had no chance to ever ride a horse again or resume normal life, at one point commented, "This is a hell of a way to die." So he then died in his sleep of an edema and heart failure at 6 p.m. on 21 December. Uh, so ironically, George S. Patton would have lived had he had a better casque or head protection and neck protection. So there's been stories written about this final days of Patton and how he was going to come forward and expose all of the debauchery of the United States military and how the war could have been ended so much sooner had he not been relieved of duty and all this stuff and the other thing. And so there are some conspiracy theorists that think that Patton was actually not accidentally killed, but intentionally killed in that slow speed chase. In any event, it leads us uh, to my conclusion that there is probably, and ironically, if you look at the original ancient Greek drawing of what traction looked like, it's actually this background of the image figure. Uh, so, um, so if you actually go look up the word traction in orthopedics, and if you click on the links in my WordPress article, it'll actually take you to these things. But if you actually look at the design of a traction device, the early Greek traction device from the Byzantine edition of Galen's work in the 2nd century AD, and you look at what an original traction device looked like, and even though the figure in that particular image is strung up there upside down, um, you get this kind of open window thing that kind of appears twice. So if you look at that bottom thing on the pedestal, and you look at this traction, the orthopedics, original Greek drawing, it's just eerily similar how that is. And it's repeated in 2 different ways in the image. So I don't know. My conclusion is that if you look in this Fort Knox area somewhere in general, and I'm not sure exactly if it's Keys Park or if it's West Point or one of these other places around the Patton Museum, or use something about George S. Patton in your Saul. Now, just so you don't go down the rabbit hole of looking at the museum that's out in California, that museum didn't open until after The Secret was printed. The main thing about Patton was in 1970 you had the movie. Scott kind of remained an important figure in this, and I'm not encouraging you to go on the established base at Fort Knox and dig anywhere. But what I would encourage, if somebody has any interest in this and they are close to Fort Knox, go to the visitors gate, get a day pass. It's pretty simple. You can still get onto military bases. Tell them you're going to the Patton Museum. Go look at a few things over there. Look at the tanks out front. And if you see anything in this image that can be correlated to this, I'm willing to accept this as proof of solve and concept for you and for me without actually digging this one up, because the tanks have been moved off of these pedestals down there. Uh, you know, it's awfully difficult to get to the actual spot uh, without having significant problem. So the solve again, if you look at the image of part of Kentucky in the image figure, you meet the metric of having the state. Um, if you look at the Thucydides and that, and if you look at who Henry Knox was, and so I also, if you look at Fort Knox, and again, just look at my secret solve WordPress.com. I actually have an aerial photo of the Patton Museum. It's awfully hard to get uh, yeah, Google Earth photographs. So you have to find outside sources. But you see, there's a school district that has a school building right by the Patton Museum. And so, it makes it a little easier. Okay, so if you go to the section of Keys Park where there's these steps, if you will, into the grassy knoll, and compare that to some information about Sparta and the amphitheater, and how all of these uh, stairs of rocks are formed. And then there's also another structure that looks like a tower that I'd love to get closer to. If you look at the runway, there's a 3 and a 6 on the runway. My best image of Edmondson Avenue, where the little amphitheater thing here is, kind of blown up to where you can see it. So let's look at who Thucydides is. He's a historian of the Peloponnesian War, and you can see how Sparta, if you look at the Sparta, and then if you look at Xenophon of Athens and who he is. So let's just say you're looking for a place of military leadership, and you're talking about 2 military leaders. Take 5 steps in the area of his direction. Now, I don't know if that's going to be, and there could be these statues of Thucydides and Xenophon, or there could be a plaque outside the museum that might have some reference to these two. There's a green tower of lights. Well, I can establish, and I know for a fact because I have a photograph of a soccer ball and a field with a green tower of lights in my photograph here. But the green tower of lights could also be that other structure that I pointed to on the entryway in the middle section. So there would be a middle section of that, right? So near those who pass the Colosseum around the museum. So there's the Colosseum. I'm thinking the Colosseum could easily be that that amphitheater that I showed you earlier. So face the water, and this could perhaps be a water tower or a water fountain. And if you look in the image, you can actually see in the background a water tower. But I think you're actually supposed to be closer to it at this point. So I'm thinking they're directing you to a fountain. So all the letters are here to see. Well, the reason if this could be like the personal letters of Beatrice to Patton, which are in the actual library at the Patton Museum. 18th day, 12th hour. Okay, so this was something that actually George S. Patton said in one of his battle cries on the Battle of the Bulge. And then lit by lamplight would be a confirmation, that, here we have somebody that had a problem with a lamp at one time. And in Truth Be Free, well, one of the things that they've always held in the park is this uh, free admission. And it's always lit by lamplight, and it's on the 18th day at midnight as part of a celebration called Movies on the Line or on the Lawn. And they've been having these movies at Keys Park for years. Or this other thing, in Truth Be Free, could be just John 6, 13, or whatever that verse. And then you're supposed to go to the rest area, the John, if you will, and then look for 6 paces and 13 another. And that gets you to the spot. But the problem is the Dixie Pixie fits in perfectly with this. The fact that you have a guy standing on the Dixie Highway sign, I think also helps with this one. So I don't know. I'm not going to spend much more time on this one because everybody thinks it's in a different location, and I honestly tried to figure out how you would get to that West Point. But in all honesty, if you look at some of this information about West Point, Kentucky, the gift giver could be telling you the truth, and when they say that it's West Point. Because they might just be telling you it's West Point, Kentucky. Because if you look at West Point, Kentucky, you've got the Ohio Valley. You got several things right there that it's right by the Ohio River. Um, you've got a Fort Duffield Park historic site. Um, and let's just say that your gift giver is telling you the truth about West Point. That Kentucky border and the Fort Duffield, and the fact that they talked about in the back of the book so much about Nixon and Nixon's going to China, and China having this great big perimeter wall. And you go look up the history of Fort Duffield, and you compare that to the fact that there used to be a 9-foot wall surrounding Fort Duffield. It could possibly be that they're not telling you they're telling you the truth about West Point. And West Point would be on the Dixie Highway, right, pretty darn close. And so it could be that. And then, so I'm not discounting the Duffield possibility. All right, folks, I think I've had enough of this one. I hope everybody enjoyed the stream. If you have any comments, please add them below. And I'll work towards doing another one.